Forget the peaceful halls of enlightened learning. Your history classes are an institutional cover-up for centuries of unhinged chaos. If modern teachers knew the truth, they'd quit tomorrow. We're talking about deadly wine riots, med students moonlighting as grave robbers, and bringing a literal pet bear to Cambridge. The illusion of the civilized classroom is dead. Your understanding of academic history is about to get a serious, chaotic upgrade. 1. Yale students essentially leveled entire city blocks over a pointless game featuring a giant inflatable ball. They didn't need rules, referees, or a coherent scoring system to unleash absolute devastation. This annual tradition quickly morphed into an outright street riot where undergraduates routinely trampled each other underfoot. They crushed parked cars into scrap metal and forced local police to intervene with batons drawn. These future elites turned a simple campus activity into the most destructive corporate team-building exercise on the planet, gone terrifyingly rogue. Administrators watched helplessly as their pristine Ivy League quad devolved into a genuine war zone of bruised ribs and shattered glass. The smartest kids in the country willingly sacrificed their physical safety for a piece of bouncy rubber. It makes you wonder about human nature. Would you survive the bladderball riot? 2. Elite British boarding schools legally transformed younger children into unpaid servants for the senior students. The administration called it character building, but the reality looked far more like a localized feudal system. Little boys were commanded to perform the most degrading tasks imaginable before breakfast. They had to sit on freezing ceramic toilet seats in the dead of winter, using their fragile body heat to pre-warm the porcelain for older teenagers. If they failed to deliver a cozy bathroom experience, they faced immediate physical punishment. These prestigious institutions dressed up an unpaid internship in hell as a noble rite of passage for the ruling class. The younger kids suffered in silence, trading their basic human dignity for a future spot in parliament. They learned power dynamics through shivering glutes, aristocracy at its finest. 3. Shivering violently inside heavy sleeping bags, children tried to take lecture notes while their fingers turned blue. In the early 1900s, schools genuinely believed the best cure for tuberculosis was forcing sick kids to attend classes outside in the middle of freezing blizzards. Teachers showed zero mercy as the winter winds howled through the open-air pavilions. The students' ink literally froze solid inside the glass jars on their desks, rendering their pens useless. Instead of providing medical treatment, these institutions opted for an educational cryotherapy program managed by a sadistic camp counselor. The kids just had to sit there absorbing algebra and hypothermia in equal measure while the administration praised the fresh breeze. Science was a wild ride back then, curing a cough with frostbite. Utterly flawless logic. 4. Engineering students flawlessly reassembled a stolen police cruiser on the apex of their university's Great Dome. They didn't just casually dump the chassis up there and call it a night. These maniacs wired the emergency lights to flash perfectly, placed a uniformed dummy officer in the driver's seat, and slapped a fake parking ticket on the windshield for maximum disrespect. The campus woke up to find a multi-million-dollar three-dimensional puzzle built solely out of borrowed federal property hovering above their heads. Authorities spent hours scratching their heads, trying to reverse engineer a prank executed with military precision. It required intense architectural calculation, sleepless nights, and a staggering amount of sheer audacity. They turned the campus skyline into a gigantic middle finger to law enforcement. What's your ultimate dream prank? 5. Once every 100 years, the most brilliant scholars at Oxford parade around the dead of night, hunting a giant imaginary duck. Grown intellectuals abandon their research, grab flaming torches, and march through historic hallways belting out a traditional song about a mythical bird. They pry open dusty closets and peer under antique mahogany desks, pretending to search for a creature that obviously doesn't exist. This prestigious event is just the ultimate academic live-action role-playing session designed for tenure-track professors with too much free time. They elevate a drunken hallucination from centuries ago into a sacred institutional mandate. You'd think the smartest minds in the world would find a better hobby, but they prefer chasing phantom poultry in the dark. It's a spectacular display of collective delusion, just elite brain rot. 6. The scent of spoiled dairy sparked a legitimate, violent uprising among the wealthiest students in America. Harvard undergraduates sparked a full-blown campus rebellion simply because the dining hall butter had gone rancid. When the students presented their very rational complaints about constant food poisoning, the administration didn't apologize or change the menu. Instead, they doubled down on their toxic dairy supply and expelled the ringleaders for blatant insubordination. The students morphed a passive-aggressive restaurant review into high-stakes academic treason, barricading themselves against the faculty. They threw down their books and refused to attend lectures, putting their elite futures on the line over foul-tasting toast spreads. The standoff highlighted just how fast civilized scholars revert to angry rioters when their stomachs hurt. What food would you riot over? 7. Medieval Irish poets believed true literary genius required agonizing darkness. They didn't study by candlelight or take inspirational walks through the green countryside. Instead, these aspiring writers lay flat on their backs in pitch-black, windowless rooms while placing heavy stone slabs directly onto their chests. They engineered a medieval weighted blanket specifically designed for extreme sensory torture. Total isolation and crushing physical discomfort were deemed the only viable methods to eliminate worldly distractions and force the brain into a state of creative overdrive. They laid there for hours, suffocating under rocks, mentally composing complex verses without a drop of ink. If you wanted to graduate as a master bard, you had to survive this claustrophobic nightmare first. They'd literally crushed the poetry out of themselves. Brutally effective methods. 8. The father of geometry harbored a crippling, irrational terror of everyday legumes. Pythagoras forbade his loyal disciples from consuming beans because he genuinely believed they contained the trapped souls of the dead. I'm not making this up. This dietary restriction ultimately cost the legendary mathematician his life. When an angry mob of murderers chased him out of town, he sprinted until he reached the edge of a blooming bean field. Rather than trample through the forbidden vegetables and escape his pursuers, he froze in place and allowed his enemies to slaughter him. He transformed a fatal version of a deeply neurotic gluten allergy into his final stand. He chose a gruesome death over risking spiritual contamination from a handful of seeds. The greatest mathematical mind of the ancient world got defeated by dinner ingredients. What's your weirdest food phobia? 9. Victorian fraternity brothers gleefully swung razor-sharp blades at each other's heads without flinching. These German university students participated in academic fencing, where winning the duel didn't matter at all. The sole objective was to stand perfectly still, absorb a brutal slash to the cheek, and then actively rub harsh salt into the fresh wound to ensure it scarred as horribly as possible. They sought out extreme plastic surgery for edgy rich kids, treating facial mutilation as the ultimate campus status symbol. Walking around with a mangled face proved you belonged to the elite aristocratic brotherhood. If you ducked or dodged the incoming blade, you faced lifelong social ruin. They hacked their own flesh to pieces just to look intimidating at the local beer hall, proudly sporting their grotesque crimson badges. Bleeding for the aesthetic. Peak vanity achieved. 10. Aspiring bureaucrats voluntarily marched into tight, coffin-sized cells to take the most grueling test in human history. Candidates for the Chinese civil service spent days locked in isolated wooden boxes, enduring freezing nights and blistering heat to prove their intellectual worth. The guards patrolled the narrow alleys, but they offered no medical assistance if a candidate collapsed from exhaustion. If a student died from the overwhelming stress, the wardens simply dragged the corpse out and tossed it over the brick wall so the surviving scholars wouldn't break their concentration. They administered the original guaranteed fatal version of a cutthroat college prep course. You either walked out with a prestigious government job or left the compound as an anonymous airborne carcass. There was no grading curve, only brutal survival. Could you survive a 3-day exam? 11. Spending your formative years navigating a social minefield meant basic vocal cords were treated as a gateway to eternal damnation. Religious schools outlawed all forms of human speech, forcing young students into an agonizing vow of silence. To survive the daily routine without getting beaten, these kids invented huge, complex catalogs of covert hand gestures. They communicated through rapid finger wiggles and subtle nods to coordinate chores and pass the time. They executed a lifelong sentence of forced text messaging without the luxury of an actual phone. One accidental giggle or a whispered request for bread earned them an immediate violent thrashing from the headmaster. They suppressed their natural instincts for years on end, trapped in a quiet, paranoid environment where the loudest sound was the shuffling of leather sandals. Institutionalized muteness, glorious silence. 12. The aspiring doctors sworn to save human lives spent their midnights plundering local cemeteries. 19th century medical students couldn't afford their exorbitant university tuition, so they turned to the lucrative underground market of fresh human corpses. They formed organized collegiate gangs, wielding shovels under the moonlight to steal newly buried bodies away from grieving families. Once they secured the prize, they hauled the dirt-covered remains back to the anatomy lab and sold them directly to their own professors for a handsome profit. The faculty essentially sanctioned the most macabre and illegal work-study program in human history. They learned human anatomy by butchering stolen grandmothers on wooden tables before the morning bell even rang. Earning a prestigious medical degree required a strong stomach and a total lack of morals, just ruthless capitalism. 13. Educators genuinely viewed a simple genetic trait as a direct manifestation of demonic influence. If a child instinctively reached for a pencil with their left hand, teachers unleashed immediate physical torment to correct the perceived evil. They tied the students' offending arms tightly behind their backs with coarse rope, leaving them helpless and off balance for the entire day. Some institutions even locked the kids' fingers into rigid wooden contraptions, violently forcing an unnatural biological switch. The schools attempted glitching the human matrix through forced reprogramming, determined to standardize every single pupil by brute force. Left-handed children endured daily beatings until their right hands learned to mimic the sloppy cursive of their peers. It was systematic psychological warfare waged over the harmless grip of a wooden ruler. Were you forced to switch hands? 14. A grim German university jail cell miraculously evolved into the most exclusive social venue on campus. Administrators built a dedicated prison to punish rebellious scholars, but the inmates swiftly hijacked the narrative. Students actively sabotaged town property and insulted officers just to guarantee their own arrest. Once locked inside, they cracked open smuggled barrels of beer, sang rowdy tavern songs, and spent their sentences painting elaborate, vibrant self-portraits on the cold plaster walls. They transformed a high-security detention center into a restricted VIP lounge where serving time became a legendary badge of honor. Leaving the university without a stint in the campus slammer meant you were a boring outcast. The authorities tried to enforce strict discipline, but they accidentally funded a non-stop underground frat party instead. Glorious institutional failure. 15. A bored Harvard undergraduate swallowed a squirming live goldfish to win a pathetic $10 bet. This single gross-out moment ignited a sweeping national crisis that brought local governments to their knees. The repulsive fad spread across college campuses like wildfire, with rival students gulping down dozens of thrashing aquatic pets to break the latest record. The situation devolved into such manic chaos that state legislatures had to draft emergency laws just to protect local pet store inventories from predatory frat boys. They executed the original fatal pre-internet viral challenge without a single smartphone in sight. Politicians held serious press conferences begging the youth to stop digesting aquarium livestock, but the madness only amplified. An entire generation risked deadly intestinal parasites for fleeting campus clout. What's the dumbest viral challenge? 16. In the oldest Western university, the arrogant scholars held the financial strings and ruthlessly bullied their own instructors. A professor walking into the lecture hall even 1 minute late faced devastating monetary fines levied by the audience. The students held the supreme power to dock their teachers' pay for skipping difficult chapters, failing to answer questions, or daring to take a brief holiday without filing a formal request. They established a reverse-engineered corporate human resources department run solely by vengeful, unpaid interns. If the faculty member's performance dropped below standard, the young mob simply bankrupted them. These medieval academics didn't beg for passing grades. They held their educators in a constant chokehold of financial terror. The syllabus was a legally binding contract enforceable by teenage rage. Sweet academic vengeance. 17. Think about that for a second. Medieval law classified ordinary university students as official members of the clergy, granting them untouchable legal status. This blatant loophole meant campus troublemakers couldn't be touched by the regular town police force, no matter the crime. A drunken scholar could literally stab a local blacksmith to death in the town square and laugh in the sheriff's face. Instead of facing the executioner's block, the murderer faced an internal academic tribunal that handed down pathetic sentences like reciting extra evening prayers or performing mild community service. They wielded a medieval diplomatic immunity cheat code custom built for violent frat boys. The townspeople lived in constant fear of these educated thugs, knowing the church would always shield them from genuine justice. Elite privilege with a body count. Unmatched arrogance. 18. A casual afternoon snowball fight among bored Ivy League youths violently mutated into a sprawling citywide catastrophe. The laughing students quickly swapped soft snow for jagged blocks of ice, shattering local storefronts and skull bones with equal enthusiasm. When the town's firefighters and police officers rushed in to restore order, the scholars pelted them with frozen artillery, escalating the skirmish into a full-scale urban conflict. The chaos spiraled so far out of control that the desperate mayor had to stand in the street and legally read the riot act to disperse the mob. They launched the most aggressive weather-based gang war in American academic history, transforming a winter wonderland into a frozen combat zone. The elite leaders of tomorrow couldn't even handle a flurry without burning their own city to the ground. Have you ever accidentally started a riot? 19. Some arrogant students threw a cup of terrible vintage into a local bartender's face, igniting a 3-day bloodbath in the streets of Oxford. The ensuing brawl didn't end with a few bruised knuckles and a shattered mirror. Townspeople and scholars waged an outright medieval war over the sour drink, resulting in 60 brutal deaths and burning buildings. Because the academics held the ultimate political leverage, the devastated town didn't get justice. Instead, the royal court forced the surviving citizens to perform a humiliating public apology and pay heavy fines every single year for the next 5 centuries. They triggered the deadliest, legally binding bar tab dispute in human history. The university crushed the local economy for generations, all because a spoiled teenager couldn't stomach a cheap glass of tavern grog. Petty vengeance on a catastrophic scale. Drink up. 20. The towering campus clock at Georgetown mysteriously lost its heavy metal hands under the cover of darkness. Instead of hiding the stolen property in a damp basement, the cunning thieves boxed up the huge clock parts and mailed them directly to the Vatican. The Pope's administrative staff repeatedly received these bizarre international packages, opening them to find random pieces of American university architecture. Highly confused by the relentless trolling, the Holy See politely shipped the hands back across the Atlantic, only for the students to steal them again. They exploited international shipping logistics to successfully prank the highest religious authority on earth. The Catholic administration found themselves locked in an endless, absurd postal war with bored undergrads. Blasphemy delivered with precise postage. The divine comedy of transcontinental mail fraud. 21. A rural agricultural fact morphed into a devastating weapon of campus destruction. Devious students discovered that cows possessed the leg mechanics to easily walk up a flight of stairs but lacked the physical coordination to descend. They guided enormous livestock into historic university buildings, abandoning the panicked beasts on the highest rooftops. When the morning sun rose, the administration faced a logistical nightmare. The trapped cows froze in sheer terror, refusing to budge a single inch downward. Frustrated deans had to either rent enormous industrial cranes to lower the wailing animals to safety, or literally butcher them on the spot to clear the stairwells. The pranksters exploited a fascinating biological glitch for maximum architectural chaos, turning the dean's office into a makeshift slaughterhouse. Rural engineering at its finest. What's the greatest animal prank? 22. Those prestigious graduation scrolls hanging in mahogany frames started off as a grotesque display of inherited wealth. Early universities didn't print degrees on crisp paper. They wrote the academic achievements on highly expensive vellum, carefully manufactured from the scraped and dried intestines of slaughtered sheep. The actual grades on the document barely mattered to the audience. The real purpose of the ceremony was the sheer financial flex of forcing the peasantry to watch you wave premium animal skin in the air. Presenting that gruesome parchment was the medieval equivalent of flashing a gold-plated Rolex at your commencement speech. It screamed to the world that your family owned land, livestock, and the unearned confidence to buy your way into polite society. Education served as a mere footnote to the slaughterhouse aesthetics, unadulterated snobbery. 23. Thomas Jefferson envisioned a serene, utopian campus for intellectual growth, but his precious university rapidly devolved into a lethal combat zone. The early student body treated the academic halls like their own personal shooting range. If a wealthy young scholar fundamentally disagreed with a professor's stance on philosophy, they didn't politely raise a hand to debate the issue. They pulled a loaded flintlock pistol out of their tailored coats and started firing lead across the lecture room. The faculty ducked for cover behind oak podiums as arrogant teenagers staged an academic Wild West saloon, shootout over early morning syllabus disputes. Teaching a simple history lesson meant wearing a bulletproof mindset and updating your last will and testament. Intellectual debate delivered at muzzle velocity, simply barbaric. Would you bring a pistol to class? 24. Imagine working tirelessly for years only to receive the most humiliating public award in academic history. Cambridge faculty hosted huge, raucous ceremonies specifically designed to mock the single graduate who secured the absolute lowest passing score in mathematics. They didn't hand this poor survivor a discreet envelope. The crowd hoisted the near failure onto their shoulders and paraded them through the courtyard holding a gigantic, 5-foot-long novelty wooden kitchen utensil. They transformed brutal public humiliation into an elite, highly anticipated campus honor. The administration forged a sarcastic participation trophy scaled up for absolute academic mediocrity, forcing the dumbest passing guy to smile through the pain. The crowd roared with laughter as the spoon banged against the ancient stone walls. A spectacular roast. 25. The eccentric poet Lord Byron arrived at his pristine Cambridge dorm, dragging a live, snarling bear on a heavy iron chain. When the furious dean stormed over to expel him, Byron calmly pulled out the official university rulebook. He forced the administration to read the fine print, logically pointing out that the text explicitly banned dogs, but remained noticeably silent on the topic of untamed apex predators. Stunned by the flawless legal loophole, the school had to concede and allow the terrifying animal to stay in the dorms. Byron orchestrated a malicious compliance masterpiece executed with a literal wild beast. He manipulated grammar to win a housing dispute, letting his furry roommate terrorize the prestigious courtyards while the faculty seethed in silence. The ultimate victory of a poetic mastermind over rigid bureaucratic red tape. Checkmate, professors. 26. The humiliating pointy hat forced upon failing students originated as a mystical tool for ultimate enlightenment. A medieval philosopher insisted that wearing a sharp, conical cap would act like an antenna, actively funneling divine genius straight from the heavens down into the human brain. His followers proudly wore these ridiculous paper cones to signify their immense, unparalleled intellect. However, rival scholars mocked the movement so relentlessly that their signature fashion statement permanently mutated into the universal symbol for a hopeless idiot. The hat suffered the ultimate historical brand assassination of an entire intellectual philosophy. A headpiece designed to capture the wisdom of the universe ended up rotting in the dusty corners of primary school classrooms, worn only by kids who couldn't spell their own names. Tragic fashion disaster. 27. Arriving on campus as a medieval freshman meant you were classified as a literal, uncultured beast of the forest. To purge this animalistic nature, the senior students subjected newcomers to brutal, agonizing physical alterations in front of a cheering crowd. The upperclassmen grabbed heavy metal files, rusted saws, and dull shears to violently shave the freshmen raw, pretending to hack off invisible horns and tusks. They carved up the young scholars under the twisted guise of spiritual and intellectual refinement. The ceremony played out like a frat hazing ritual designed by a demonic blacksmith with a grudge against humanity. The terrified new kids stood there, bleeding and trembling, finally accepted into the Brotherhood only after they shed a layer of their own skin. Suffering forged the bonds of elite academic excellence. Welcome to the university! 28. Two prestigious American colleges engaged in a relentless, absurd turf war over a hunk of obsolete military artillery. Rutgers and Princeton students spent decades sneaking onto each other's campuses in the dead of night to steal a heavy war cannon. The rivals dragged the iron gun back and forth across state lines, constantly humiliating the opposing administration. The undergraduates proved so fiercely petty that the exhausted deans finally decided to permanently bury the cannon deep underground and encase it in thick concrete just to stop the endless theft cycle. The schools engaged in a century-long game of capture, the flag permanently ruined by a contractor pouring fresh cement. They chose architectural vandalism over letting the other team win a prank war. The ultimate monument to stubborn collegiate spite remains locked in the dirt forever. Total stalemate. 29. Spartan educators intentionally starved little children to mold them into lethal, undetectable thieves. The brutal curriculum dictated that if a student wanted to eat, they had to sneak into the local village and pilfer their daily meals without leaving a single trace. One legendary boy snatched a live fox, but when his ruthless instructor approached, he swiftly hid the panicked animal underneath his tunic. The boy stood perfectly at attention, staring straight ahead in unbroken silence, while the trapped beast literally clawed and chewed his stomach open. He chose to die bleeding on the dirt floor rather than face the humiliating shame of getting caught. The ancients ran a Black Ops survival course for 7-year-olds featuring 0 safety nets. They didn't rely on bronze swords, iron shields, or a premium VPN subscription, just sheer, terrifying willpower. 30. The most elite teenagers in Britain willingly subject themselves to an athletic event that offers practically zero emotional payoff. Eton students pile into the freezing mud to play a violent, chaotic scramble against a curved brick wall. The rules of this bizarre sport remain so ridiculously convoluted and the physical toll so severe that the last time a team successfully scored a legally recognized goal was back in 1909. Generations of aristocrats have smashed their faces into the masonry for over a century without ever experiencing the thrill of a victory point. They sustain a Sisyphean nightmare masquerading as a prestigious elite athletic tradition. The players claw at the dirt, ripping their expensive uniforms to shreds just to end the miserable afternoon in a guaranteed 0-point tie. Joyless athleticism at its finest. Just endless mud. 31. A socially awkward foreign exchange student turned a playful winter recess into a devastating lesson in modern warfare. Before he conquered continents, a young Napoleon Bonaparte organized his classmates and dug literal icy trenches to win a boarding school snowball fight. The wealthy, entitled aristocrats on the opposing team got mercilessly obliterated by the weird kid who treated the playground like an active military campaign. He directed flanking maneuvers, built fortified snow bunkers, and pelted his terrified peers with relentless, calculated volleys of ice. The future emperor essentially operated as a strategic mastermind, shamelessly smurfing in a beginner lobby. He commanded his small army of shivering preteens with cold, psychopathic precision, securing an undeniable victory. An empire built on slush and bruised egos. Total domination. 32. The Victorian era stripped the joy out of learning and replaced it with grim industrial efficiency. Schools designed for impoverished children never intended to teach critical thinking or foster artistic talent. Instead, the brutal headmasters trained the kids to march in unison to the shrill blast of brass whistles, just like expendable soldiers heading to the front lines. The entire curriculum functioned as a deliberate weapon to kill creativity and pump out obedient, subservient factory workers who wouldn't dare question the expanding empire. They constructed a soulless assembly line ruthlessly optimized for human obedience. A child's imagination was treated as a dangerous defect that required immediate elimination through endless drills and memorization. Mindless drones assembled. Seriously, take a deep breath and look at the sheer scale of the madness we just covered. We're sitting here pretending that education is a civilized, enlightened journey, but the historical evidence screams the exact opposite. Between the freezing tuberculosis tents, the lethal dueling scars, and the rampant grave robbing, the classroom looks more like a terrifying horror movie franchise. But if I have to crown one absolute champion of this academic nightmare, the trophy goes directly to the Chinese imperial exams. Think about the sheer unhinged dedication required for a guard to grab the lifeless corpse of a stressed-out student and casually hurl it over a brick wall just so the others can finish their essays in peace. That's the undisputed peak of institutional cruelty. It makes every modern exam look like a gentle spa retreat. What breaks the human mind faster, a test or the truth? 33. Relieved graduates used to hold solemn, theatrical funerals to literally bury their most hated textbooks in the dirt. Centuries of supposed elite enlightenment really just boil down to freezing classrooms, stolen artillery, and profound misery. The true battlefield of history isn't the war zone, it's the classroom, where survival was the only real diploma. Tell me in the comments, which historical punishment breaks you first? Tied left hands, warming toilet seats, or corpse-throwing exams? The most brilliant defense gets pinned in the next video.